Hello, everyone. This is the 248th episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back English author Mr. Ivan McDouall as we discuss Aston Villa in the decade of the 1980s. Mr. McDouall is a lifelong Aston Villa fan and author of the book Only the Real Thing, Aston Villa and the Coca-Cola Cup, 1993 to 1996. He also writes for the Aston Villa fan podcast, the UTV Podcast. Welcome back, Ivan.
Thank you very much for having me. Really good to be back to talk about a different decade in Villa's history.
Indeed, let's go back in time. So, what was the status of Aston Villa in the English football landscape as we come to the beginning of the decade of 1980?
Well, yeah, I think we almost have to go back a little bit further than right at the start of the decade because I think there's so much context that we need to understand that the 80s was going to be such a tremendous decade for Villa, but the period leading up to it was very much up and down as well. And Villa had found themselves relegated the first time in the third tier under Tommy Docherty, but actually a really kind of pivotal time at the club that Doug Ellis was first involved. And I know we're gonna talk about him later on. But actually, those kind of years in the third division kind of set Villa up in a sense of the trajectory that we will discuss in the 80s. That 1970, 71, things looked okay under Vic Crow. We were fourth. We actually lost to Spurs in the League Cup final as a third division side, having beaten Manchester United in the semi-final. And it's around that time that we'd see players that starting to come into the club, the likes of Chris Nicholl, Ian Ross, that would really pave the way for what would become a 1980s Villa side. Bodymore Heath had been open, which is the Aston Villa training ground. So Doug Ellis was instrumental in that. So that opened in 1971. And again, although that's quite a long way from the 80s, began to set a process in motion where a lot of young players, so Brian Little, John Gidman, etc., that would be important players as the 80s neared. They won a 1972 FA Youth Cup, which again I think really kind of set in motion some of the trends that we would see in the 80s. And once Villa got on that out of the third division, they narrowly missed out actually on successive promotions. But then obviously once Ron Saunders comes in the mid 70s, we then really get into this kind of story that finalizes itself in the decade that we're going to talk about.
Ron Saunders had been in charge since 1974 when we come to the beginning of 1980. What can you say about his trajectory and his stewardship of the team in these years?
Well, I mean, he quite simply overhauled the club in influence as a manager. And one of the first things that he did, which I think really helps understand Ron Saunders and kind of what he was like. So he'd been at Manchester City where he managed a midfielder called Frank Carradus. And he arranged essentially to bring Frank Carradus to Villa, ostensibly with him. And this was much to the annoyance of Doug Ellis, who liked to control those transfer dealings. And I think right from the off, that was Saunders putting a marker in the sand. And I think that would very much characterise what would happen under Saunders' reign. Ron Saunders was a difficult man to work for players. He was a very harsh critic of people. Some of those younger players that I just mentioned that were kind of coming through from that FA Youth Cup winning team, the likes of Brian Little, John Gidman. Saunders was a very harsh critic of players like that. And I think, in kind of modern parlance, there might be an aspect where he would be described as a bully. He was certainly a very intimidating character, prioritized kind of work over everything. And actually, when that in those early days at Villa, attacking players would not be overly involved in training routines, etc. He was very much focused on that idea that his Villa team was going to defend first and be solid, and then go from there. But obviously promoted under Saunders, 74, 75, and he played a really kind of exciting formation, so 4-3-1-2 with Brian Little playing behind two strikers, and Brian Little at this time is just an exceptional player to watch, and I think one that absolutely, and I'm sure as we come through the decade, we'll kind of understand that, but one that, despite Saunders' quite harsh criticism of, actually was really valuable to the team, and Saunders, obviously knew that. So yeah, Little was exceptional in that. Villa, of course, as well as winning promotion under Saunders in 74-75, won a League Cup as a second division team, beating Norwich 1-0 at Wembley, and Ray Graydon scored the goal, who would go on to score lots of goals over lots of appearances for Villa. One of the Saunders stories that always makes me smile, and that will come to some context to this, I'm sure, is that after that season, so after they'd been promoted from the second division and beaten Norwich in the League Cup, Doug Ellis somewhat unusually paid for a Caribbean sort of post-season tour, and Ron Saunders insisted on flying back and forth from the Caribbean to collect he'd been awarded the Bells Manager of the Year award. So, and keep that in your head when we come to talk about some later fallouts within Villa. So Saunders absolutely knew his own mind, I guess, and ultimately took us back up into the top flight.
And also, this is probably the Scottish Andy Gray. That's probably his best era as a footballer, his Aston Villa spell near this tail end of the 70s. When discussing your book, Only the Real Thing, Aston Villa and the Coca-Cola Cup, 1990-96, we spent some time discussing Chairman Doug Ellis and his important role at the club. As we come to the beginning of this decade, we have to bear in mind that he had left his post in 1975. He would return, but the chairmen in this era were Sir William Dugdale, Harry Katz, and Ron McDouall. What can you say about these boardroom changes?
Yeah, I mean, can't talk about Villa over this period without Ellis being a huge kind of thing hanging over that. For a starting point, Ellis to me was crucial for Villa, and as I've mentioned, he was instrumental in having set up Bodymore Heath, that focus on youth, and actually around that time when we were in the third and second division was incredibly important in instilling some financial stability into the club. Obviously, in hindsight, Ellis's reputation is very much about being parsimonious and deadly Doug and all these sorts of things. But there was no doubt that he was incredibly invested in ensuring Aston Villa continued to be viable and, where possible, then successful. And I think that you're right. Obviously, he was no longer chairman from 75, but he was still around then until around 79. So he was still around at the club, but had lost that, essentially his majority shares, to Ron Bendel, who you mentioned. And I think Bendel's probably the key player in the story around Doug Ellis at this time, because Saunders wanted control of the club, as we talked about earlier, and he wanted to, from a playing side, be in complete influence of that. And that didn't always chime well with Doug Ellis, who equally wanted to be involved. He would be at Bodymore a lot. He would, want to be in all the photos, things like that. And so there was this inevitable friction between Ron Saunders and Doug Ellis that ultimately then led to some infighting on the board, because Ron Saunders was an astute and clever man, and essentially undermined Ellis with some of his board colleagues and created an environment where Ellis's position was as chairman was at risk, and then really once he was just a kind of another board member, that also began to peter out as Ron Bendel managed to kind of accrue those shares. The great irony that Bendel was, he was not a football man. He wasn't particularly a Villa man either. His son was a big Villa fan. There was often a view that he'd kind of taken it on really to somehow sort of mend a relationship possibly with his son. So I don't think, I think when we look at Ellis and unpick his legacy, it's always to me in that context that he genuinely did love Villa and he absolutely wanted the best for them. And I think that sometimes when we reflect back and actually as we move forward through the decade, although Ron Saunders at the time thought Ron Bendel was the better bet than Doug Ellis, that didn't necessarily turn out to be the case.
So, what was the backbone of the team as we come to the start of this decade?
Yeah, I mean, again, another really interesting question, because Ron Saunders was always very keen to refresh his sides, So actually under his tenure, and even though there'd been relatively success, so 1977, Villa win another League Cup. So following on from 74, so the second under Saunders, marathon game against Everton, two replays. Chris Nicol is the captain, scores the winning goal in the final replay, and is then sold. Which I think probably sums up a little bit of Ron Saunders's kind of fairly ruthless sort of rebuilding of sides. But actually, when you look at that 77 side, which is only then we're only kind of 2, 3 years away from the start of the 80s. Actually, with the exception of Dennis Mortimer and well, Brian Little sort of fleetingly, a lot of those players have gone by the time we reach the 80s. So I think he's sort of very much was of the mind that he could see a kind of threshold of players. And I think that often focused on midfield. So I mentioned Frank Carradus earlier, who he brought in and was fantastic for Villa, like a real engine room type player. But actually, I think he began to think, well, when are we going to sort of rebuild that midfield? And we had a very young player coming through at the time of the 77 League Cup final. And he did actually play in the two replays, Gordon Cowans. So that became, with Dennis Mortimer, the nucleus for sort of rebuilding the midfield. And actually, a player like Carradus, who'd been so important, began to be shifted out. The other player that you mentioned, obviously, was Andy Gray. And actually, a Holt End hero, had a huge influence at the club, had won in 77 the PFA Player of the Year and the Young Player of the Year, which was a phenomenal achievement to win both of those, and underlines that his sort of goal scoring prowess for Villa. So he was very much again playing ahead of Brian Little, often with John Dee, and Andy Gray was an exceptional part of that backbone as we kind of come into that period. I mentioned earlier about Saunders flying back and forth from the Caribbean, but around the time of those awards that Andy Gray won was obviously when Ron Saunders actually stopped him going to London to pick up the awards, which is obviously ironic given that he'd flown back and forth from the Caribbean. And I think probably the beginning of a bit of a disintegration with Gray and his relationship. But then again, as we very much sort of, about as that decade is beginning to sort of turn, we're then seeing the likes of Jimmy Rimmer coming in, Ken McDouall, Alan Evans, and these are the players that are really then going to form the backbone into the 1980s, along with Cowans, as I mentioned. A very young Gary Shaw is also coming through. So we're beginning to see that. But I think what characterises this era for me is Saunders' willingness, really, to take players out that had actually been quite instrumental, whether that, the Chris Nichols, the Frank Carraduses, and actually replace and upgrade. And I think he was always very adamant that that was important. And I think it puts into some context maybe what happened later in the decade as well, even though Saunders wasn't there at that point.
And of course, this is the era of Liverpool and to some extent Brian Clough's Nottingham Forest. So I imagine no one could have expected the 1980-81 league title, given the trajectory of the team in the previous seasons. Was Peter Witt the missing ingredient up front that made a difference, you think?
Yes and no. Yes and no. And I think that to say yes just as a kind of simple answer is kind of undermines Andy Gray's influence a little bit. And I think that because Saunders had built that, as I say, fairly feared kind of strike force, really, of John Dee and Andy Gray and then Brian Little often playing just sort of behind them in that, I suppose, what is now a kind of sort of false nine, like sort of number 10 position. But I think because Gray had sort of suffered quite a lot with his knee, there was an issue that Saunders had kind of peddled really around a UEFA Cup tie against Barcelona, where Gray had declared himself fit, but Saunders kind of went to the press and said he'd let the club down by not playing and things like this. There was a lot of friction there. So when Gray left for Wolves in the September of 1979, gosh, 1779, 1979, there was a huge gap to fill. So I think that the fact that actually for a little while they couldn't fill that gap, in that sense, Peter With coming in was absolutely the missing piece of the jigsaw because they had lost Andy Gray, if you like. So, and Saunders always liked the idea of a kind of a big physical striker to kind of hold the ball up. And Gray and With were different players, but they were of the same ilk. And I think that in essence, yes, With was the missing piece of the jigsaw because he needed to replace Gray. But actually, my understanding is that With wasn't actually first choice in terms of the players coming in. So Saunders was desperate to sign a fairly journeyman-like player, in my opinion, Mick Ferguson from Coventry, and actually, he was a real target man, a bit like With, and he was very much on the radar as being kind of the replacement for Gray, which obviously never happened. And also Tony Barton, who was at the time was chief scout for Saunders, he was very much pushing an agenda of signing Ian Rush from Chester. Now, of course, Ian Rush ended up at Liverpool, and the rest is history. So I think yes, he was the missing ingredient in a way because there was a hole in the recipe, so to speak, that we needed to fill. And he ended up doing that very well. I think there's kind of more to it. But what he did ultimately do by coming into the side was really fill that void of that hold up play that a lot of our Villa's attacking players at the time, so Tony Morley, Gary Shaw, could actually really feed off. And I think that was where it became really important to have a player like With. And obviously he went on to cement his legacy very, very powerfully.
So let's look at this historical 1980-81 season with Aston Villa winning the league title for the first time since 1910. This was achieved with minimal transfer activity, and we often hear how only 14 players took part in that season. And much more significant was that it was against a brilliant Ipswich Town side of Bobby Robson. So, can you walk us through this historic achievement?
Yeah, I mean, it was phenomenal. I mean, I think it's worth just repeating that is that Aston Villa hadn't won a league title since 1910. And obviously, Villa are a historic club and have won a lot of honours, but a lot of those honours were in Victorian and immediately post-Victorian times. So, and considering that a decade previously Villa were a third division side, this is a phenomenal achievement. And everything about it is unique. And, as you've mentioned, only using 14 players. I mean, that well, obviously it just wouldn't be possible now, but it was unprecedented at the time as well. Obviously squads weren't as big generally, but to only use 14 players pointed, I think, to an absolute atmosphere that Ron Saunders had generated, a desire of that team to fight for one another. And again, you mentioned Ipswich, and to win that, Ipswich were a phenomenal side. I mean, actually, they beat Villa three times over the season, twice in the league and knocked Villa out of the FA Cup. So there was no doubting their sort of abilities as well. And I think I mean I'll kind of go into a bit more detail, but ultimately they probably did think they'd won the league at some point, but because they were fighting on lots of fronts, they were still in the FA Cup. They went on to win the UEFA Cup that season
Yes.
as well. So they were a phenomenal side. So it's this wonderful mix of kind of a bit of fortune, a bit of wonderful football, and just real kind of a fairy tale story, really, of Villa winning that league title. They started the season incredibly well, and August was just, it was like a train. Tony Morley, who Villa had brought in from Preston, was phenomenal. Gary Shaw, again, very young player, both playing off Peter With, absolutely scored a lot of goals over the start of that season. With chipped in as well. They drew away at City, and with got a couple of goals. And then the game that really stands out for me in that kind of August period is they absolutely eviscerated Leeds in a League Cup game. And it was that triumvirate of With, Morley and Shaw that absolutely kind of drove Villa forward, but built on that very defensive like minded set that Ron Saunders instilled. He had a very strong belief that two centre backs, in the case of Ken McNaughton and Alan Evans, then that three that we mentioned earlier, so Cowans, Mortimer, that was then supplemented by Des Bremner, it was very much built on that very solid kind of aspect of play. And talking about Ipswich, Villa had this great start, but actually it sort of began to there was some question marks because the first game they lost that season was to Ipswich, and then they lost again to Everton the following week, and it just felt like things were maybe kind of dropping off a little bit, and not added to the fact that second division Cambridge then managed to knock Villa out of the League Cup. So the atmosphere wasn't great. And I think that Tony Morley has said about that Cambridge game is that Villa just went out and thought they were going to win. And actually, I think in hindsight, that result, although it was in the League Cup, was really important because it reminded the Villa players, as I'm sure Saunders did, that nothing was going to be kind of taken for granted. So actually, after that, that again really picked up again. They didn't lose in the league until late November. Again, some really highlight sort of standout games. Beat Brighton 4-1. A great goal from Dennis Mortimer in that game. So really, again, as you're kind of getting into Christmas and the New Year, it's really starting to sort of that momentum to build and sort of culminated in December with a great Derby Day win against Birmingham, which is always well received. So a nice 3-0 win. But then again, Ipswich become involved, knocked Villa out the FA Cup in 1981 of the new year. And again, I think that sort of sows a bit of a seed of doubt in Villa initially, but actually that again, that benefit of almost being knocked out the FA Cup allowed Villa to focus then entirely on the league, whereas Ipswich had other matters. And Villa again then went on another great run and beaten over January and February of 1981, including possibly my favourite game of that season is when we beat Everton away and Tony Morley scored what would become match of the day's goal of the season. Great story as well about the fact that, I mean, Morley was a Scouser, Everton fan, would have, desperate to play at Goodison, and Saunders had wound him up a little bit and said, we need players that are going to fight for the ball, so you won't be playing. Now, obviously, he did. He scored this wonderful goal in a great win and very famously flicked some V signs at Saunders, which I'm sure went down terribly and resulted in various fines for Tony Morley. But it was such a great result that I think that's when, certainly for me and others and the team, that seemed to when that belief thought, right. But guess what? Ipswich then came around again and beat Villa again. And again, it's this kind of, they just would not go away. They just absolutely would not go away. And they beat us 2-1 at Villa Park. And that was the day that Ron Saunders famously, when asked by Brian Moore about the fact that Ipswich essentially were potentially back in the box seat after that victory at Villa Park, uttered his famous quote of, "Do you want to bet against us?" Which is a quote that still adorns the stands at Villa Park today and fans reference often. And I think it was such a Saunders quote, such a it was a real kind of stubbornness of, do you really think we can't do this? And I think that, there's stories of Ipswich players celebrating in the dressing room at Villa Park like they'd won the league that night. And if the Villa players needed any motivation, then Saunders would give it to them, but also that idea that perhaps Ipswich felt that things were done, maybe added to that. But actually, interestingly, is after that, another twist in the tail. Ipswich won only one of their last five games, so they had a big European semi-final against Cologne, which I think definitely took both energy out of their legs and kind of focus in their minds. And to only win one of that last five, I mean, no one would have thought that. Ipswich had been phenomenal. And obviously, then it's up to Villa to capitalise that, which they largely did initially. And we were essentially into that last day of the season. Villa go to Highbury and lose to Arsenal with things in our hands. Now, what then is now a quiz question, I guess, is that who was Villa's hero that day, given we lost at Highbury? Well, somewhat maligned Bosko Jankovic scored twice for Middlesbrough to beat Ipswich, therefore handing Villa the title. So very famous scenes of Villa fans at Highbury running onto the pitch after a loss, but luckily Bosko Jankovic had saved the day. So a huge, amazing battle with Ipswich really over the season, and obviously I was delighted that Villa came out on top of that.
The following season, 1981-82 season, would be another historic season for Aston Villa, who, while they fell off the pace in the league, they did win the Champions Cup by defeating Bayern Munich of Karl-Heinz Rummenigge and Paul Breitner in the final. And we know about the whole legend of Nigel Spink replacing Jimmy Rimmer in goal early in the match. And this is a time when English clubs were dominating the European Cups. I believe this was like the sixth consecutive English win in the competition. And all this despite a managerial change during the season with Ron Saunders leaving and Tony Barton replacing him in the tail end of the season. Can you describe the significance of this achievement for a club like Aston Villa that was not a regular European participant? And follow that up by explaining the departure of Ron Saunders in the middle of all of this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is and remains a phenomenal achievement. You know, the first time Villa had competed in the top tier of European competition and had only had a brief dalliance with the UEFA Cup previously. And why Villa fans still sing now, you know, champions of Europe, you'll never sing that. You know, and there are, you know, arguably bigger clubs in the UK that have never won that competition and still haven't. I mean, I think it was, and the moments that you've just kind of bookmark there, and we'll talk through them a little bit more, is, you know, they are etched into Villa's history. You can't visit Villa Park without understanding that history around the 1982 European Cup. But yeah, what a circumstance to do it in, because Villa really, after winning the league, you know, in the league, really, really fell away badly. And then as much as 14 players had worked in 80-81, you know, it was clear that that wasn't going to be able to be repeated. But Ron Saunders was very frustrated because he essentially couldn't get any more funds. And this is where, despite the boardroom changes that we talked about earlier, and essentially Saunders had been pleased that Bendall had come in, but actually suddenly here now the relationships are beginning to sour because Saunders isn't getting what he wants. So in the summer of 81, Villa only brought one player in, who was Andy Blair from Coventry. Good young player who would contribute well to Villa over two spells over the 80s, but he wasn't going to change the message essentially that Saunders felt that, you know, he wanted that refresh. And as I talked about earlier, even after big wins, you know, League Cups and promotions, he still always wanted to refresh. And I think that he was denied that. He was very frustrated with what he perceived at the time as really kind of financial mismanagement. So he'd often use a term in the press about funds being eaten up. So you often sort of use that as a soundbite. And what he was essentially alluding to was the fact that Villa had qualified for the European Cup from winning the league, which brought in at the time around another £500,000. Brian Little, who we haven't really talked about too much, but unfortunately his career had been lost to injury. Villa received an insurance payout around about 400,000. So there was even those two sums of money. Saunders's argument was, well, you know, some of that needs to be reinvested into my playing stuff. Now, and when he talks about these funds being eaten up, they're the sort of funds he's talking about because his fairly basic argument was, well, this money's coming in and where's it going? Now, probably where it was going at the time was Villa were building a North Stand, which is still stood today. In fact, it's where my season ticket is. And there was a lot of funds and issues with that stand. And actually, down the line, there would be a police investigation about the mismanagement of funds in that. So Saunders probably had a point, really, with, you know, there was a lot of ire from Saunders at the stadium manager called Terry Rutter, who, as I say, he was one of the people later arrested by the police for sort of financial malfeasance around some of those funds. So I think it kind of turned out Saunders had a point, really. So I think that actually to do that, to make that point was brave, but he obviously thought he was in a position of strength because he just won the league. Unfortunately, you know, Bendel called his bluff in essence and served him. So Saunders was on a 3-year rolling contract. So Bendel served him a 3-year notice period, which essentially was sort of sacking him in advance because of the way the contract works. However, what kind of, you know, obviously Saunders was essentially there for a little bit, but they couldn't sustain this, you know, and much as the relationship with Ellis had broken down previously, it had now broken down with Bendel. But because of Bendel's control of the club, it was Saunders that ultimately resigned in February 1982, which, I mean, it was shocking. You know, this was a man that had taken Villa up from the second division, had won 2 League Cups, had taken Villa to the first championship in since 1910, and he walked away. But Villa fans, their ire was directed to the board and actually initially to Tony Barton, who came in as initially as caretaker, then to be permanent. I think that was probably a little bit unfair. There was a lot of Villa fans who kind of were just so so distraught that Saunders had walked away that kind of anything that was going to replace him was seen as being slightly problematic. Of course, Saunders ended up across the city at Blues, which I think Ron Saunders, there was probably an air of, you know what, I'll show you with that, or that didn't necessarily materialise. But so yeah, so Tony Barton is caretaker initially, and then in April he's given the job permanently. And I think by that point, Villa are very much kind of, set on that idea that Barton can, for want of a better term, sort of continue Saunders's work a little bit and kind of build that through. And as I say, the league campaign is largely a disaster, mainly because of injuries, and I think that where Villa had been incredibly lucky in 80-81, where they hadn't had injuries, suddenly in 81-82, Ken McNaught's out, he's got a problem with blood clots in his legs. Gary Shaw, I mean, that's a huge blow when he starts kind of experiencing the injuries that will ultimately impact on him. And actually, the replacements that were coming in, so the likes of Brendan Ormsby sort of having to play at centre back instead of McNaught, they just can't cut it. But in Europe, it's a different matter. And Villa look absolutely superb. A lot of the players of the time describe, Villa are quite suited to play in European football because of that very much kind of defensive mindedness, winning possession back from that solid base and then allowing the creative players to flourish. And I think that there's an element of truth in that. So Villa beat FC Valur 5-0 over two legs, including some goals for Terry Donovan, who's a name we've not heard too much about and won't hear too much about again. And then some really exciting trips, if exciting is the right word, behind the Iron Curtain. So Dynamo Berlin, two great Tony Morley goals away from home, and a very famous Jimmy Rimmer save from a Berlin penalty. A kind of double save really, because he saved it and then saved it again off the bar. But actually, of course, that the Dynamo Berlin would be Saunders' last involvement in essence, because by the time Villa go to Kiev in the next round, Barton's in charge. Very famously, Villa took their own food to Kiev because they didn't feel they could trust what was going on. Although Gordon Cowens tells a story about finding a cockroach in his bread roll, so I guess they did eat some food that they
And
didn't.
we should mention this is the Dynamo Kiev of Valery Lobanovsky with the likes of Oleg Blokhin and all the other stars of that era.
Absolutely. And I mean, of course, Blockin had won the Ballon d'Or 5 years previously, and absolute legend of world football. It was they were a good side, and also, the travel, they didn't actually play in Kiev is my recollection. I think they were kind of 400 odd miles south in a different city. And so I think they made it very hard. The away leg, I think, was a real kind of battle, 0-0, but then took them back to Villa Park and a really nice 2-1 win. Gary Shaw was back to full fitness, as was Ken McNaught, and both of them scored as well, which probably underlines their importance to the side. Villa triumph over Anderlecht then in the semi-final.
Another great side we should mention. Star-studded with Belgian internationals, Danish internationals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we all know this, but the European Cup at this time is made up of champions, and genuine champions, and therefore great sides that have won their leagues and some really historic sides, with the exception probably of, with all due respect, FC Valur in that first round. You then go into Berlin, to Kiev, to Belgium. This is tough. And you're right, Anderlecht are such a historic side. But again, our man Tony Morley scores a winner in the first leg at Villa Park, which I think is a very Villa goal. So Rimmer out to Cowens, Cowens to Shaw, Shaw to Morley, 1-0 Villa. The away leg was 0-0. I think Villa knew that they had to go there and just try and survive with that 1-0 advantage. It was marred, unfortunately, by some crowd trouble. So there was a number of incidents in the crowd, and then also a pitch invasion, which didn't stop the game for a particular length of time, but did interrupt it briefly. And there was then, an appeal from Anderlecht that actually they would have scored if the pitch invasion hadn't happened. Villa had to kind of make an appeal to UEFA, etc., which was led, in fact, by an MP, Dennis Howell, who was a Villa fan. But Villa survived with a fine. They would have to play their next home European tie, but it's behind closed doors, which would turn out to be the following season. So yeah, I think there was an element that Villa felt fortunate that, because those decisions could have gone either way. And I think probably if it had been 5 years later, and perhaps in different context of how English fans were viewed, maybe, then it might have been a different punishment. But Villa found themselves facing the might of Bayern Munich in the final. And if we're talking about great teams and great players, Munich were absolutely this at the time. And I mean, Villa, no one thought Villa would compete, I would argue. I think that the pressure was almost entirely on Bayern. Villa leading up to the final in Rotterdam won 2 out of 7 league games. So, they were not on particularly great form anyway. Maybe that expectancy worked in a sense. And actually, Villa, again, sort of a bit like the league winning season, those sort of fairy tale moments went for Villa and Jimmy Rimmer coming off with an injured neck, very early on. Nigel Spink, who'd played, I think, one competitive game for Villa previously, never would have expected to be playing in that game. And in fact, I sense that this story might be slightly embellished, but he does, he very famously remembers Gary Newbon was the ITV commentator, was sat next to him on the bench. And when Rimmer was coming off, apparently Spink said, "Well, what's going to happen now?" And Gary Newbon turned to him and said, "Well, you're coming on." And obviously Spink put in the performance of his life, an amazing servant to Villa over this decade and into the 90s, but nothing obviously would surpass that. A very young, inexperienced goalkeeper put in the performance of his life. And at the other end, our man Peter With, so the one we sort of debated whether it was that missing piece of the jigsaw. He certainly was that night. I think some of his teammates would argue that he shinned it in. But yeah, what an important goal in the history of Aston Villa Football Club. And Villa win the final 1-0. And yeah, we shall forever have that night in Rotterdam.
These successes opened the doors of the national team to some Aston Villa players in line for the 1982 World Cup. While Peter Witt made this World Cup squad, though he did not see much action, Tony Morley missed out, as did Gary Shaw, who was never capped. Gordon Cowans would gain a number of caps in the following years, and many believe that Alan Evans was selected for Scotland only due to his form with Villa in this brief period. Was there a feeling of injustice given the team's success?
Yeah, I think to a point. I mean, I think that there were a lot of players in that era who missed out on international recognition beyond Aston Villa Football Club. International teams played less games for a start. I think the England qualified players were particularly unlucky because Ron Greenwood seemed to be intent on sticking with a very set pattern, and had his favourites, although I'm not really sure that's any different in international football now. Peter Widd, you're right, went to the 1982 World Cup, but played a grand total of 0 minutes, so he might have been there, but his contribution was not allowed in essence. I think for me, it's the Dennis Mortimer, Gary Shaw, Tony Morley. These are players that had an exceptional 2 seasons. Had won the league and had then won the European Cup. And all right, yes, domestically they hadn't perhaps performed at the same level, but these were astonishingly good players, and all of them were in the initial 40-man squad for 82. But those three weren't taken, and I think they should feel hard done by. And I think because of the context that we know, although they didn't at the time, that those caps would not really come, or certainly not for Shaw and Mortimer. Morley did win a handful, but I think there was. It seemed a real shame, and Scotland as well. I mean, again, Alan Evans went to the 1982 World Cup, did play in the opening game, but then wasn't seen again. But it's more about the players that missed out. So you got Ken McDouall again had been absolutely colossal alongside Evans and Des Bremner, who did have one cap, but was
Right,
never
in
really around.
1976, yeah.
Yeah, never really around that Scotland team, which I think so. It is a shame, and there's always context. These were eras where there were great players. So England. If you're thinking about Dennis Mortimer, England had players that were obviously really strong in that area. Ray Wilkins, Brian Robson, etc. Scotland had great centre backs to maybe keep McNaught out. Willie Miller, Alex McLeish, Alan Hansen. So, but yeah, it was disappointing. I think that's fair to say.
Just to put it in context, Gary Shaw had been the PFA Young Player of the Year in 1981, and actually in 1982 he had won the Bravo Award, which is the best young player in European competitions.
Yeah.
So, if anyone had a claim, perhaps it was him.
Yeah, and he always argued, and God rest his soul. He always argued that he was almost better appreciated outside of England, and I think there is some truth in that. Certainly European sides. Me and my son visited Rotterdam in 2025, and when we were at the Coit, our tour guide was at the European Cup final in '82, and he waxed lyrical about Shaw. That was the player that he remembered, and not just from that game, but like his contributions. And I think you're right, the Bravo Award absolutely bears that out.
This year, 1982, would also mark the return of Doug Ellis as chairman, though in some ways he oversaw the decline in the next few years. How was his return viewed at that time?
Well, I think that because of what had happened with Saunders and Bendel and the ultimate resignation of Saunders, I think the path was clearer for Ellis, for both from a fan point of view and also from his fellow board members, because things had kind of unravelled a bit. So Bendel had really lost momentum in the boardroom. As I said, there was this ongoing police investigation into financial sort of malfeasance around the North Stand, which I think again put a shade of concern really amongst the board in terms of how things were going. So actually, I think it was kind of the path was cleared a little bit for him to sort of re-emerge in November 1982. Although I'm not sure whilst the fans and his fellow board members maybe were a bit more well accepting, probably rather than welcoming, the players were not keen because they saw it as a return to the sort of parsimonious ways. Because actually, under Bendel, Villa had spent more money, and if you look at the club accounts, there's a big wage increase over those kind of 4 years where Ellis wasn't. At 3 years where Ellis wasn't at the club, so I think the players were kind of a little bit doubtful about where this was going to lead. When he did come back, I mean, Ellis was always. It's difficult to confirm this figure or not, but Ellis, when he came back, was always very open about claiming the club was 1.8 million pounds in debt. Now, various people have questioned that or that figure, but there is no doubt that Villa were in some financial difficulty, not just because of the North Stand and the police issue, but because the fact they had, if not in transfers through wages and bonuses, had actually sort of had increased their spend quite a lot. So actually, when Ellis came back in, he had that same job he had in the late 60s, early 70s, of actually having to kind of steady the ship a little bit. And I think people often forget that with Doug, is that that's what he had to do, and that's what he did. And that shows to me that he had that real desire to make sure Villa remained vital and could compete. I think the other thing, though, if we're honest, is that he always felt disappointed that his time away from the club had been when they won the league and the European Cup. And I think that whilst he was never, particularly vocal or exact about there is absolutely truth in that. And I think there's inevitably, you or I would be the same, is he felt he'd missed out on those things. And because he couldn't take credit for them, there would begin, as we now go through the rest of the decade, to be some level of marginalization of that triumph and the players that achieved it.
The 1982-83 season is the first full season of Tony Barton in charge, and he offloads some players. Gary Shelton goes to Sheffield Wednesday. Players like Ivor Linton, Terry Bollivant, and backup goalkeeper Mark Kendall are all offloaded as well, as is Kenny Swain, who joins Nottingham Forest. And the only significant arrival is Alan Kirbishley, but that's in March of 1983 from Birmingham City. So there is a slight improvement in the league as Aston Villa finished sixth and just made it to the UEFA Cup. The European adventure from the previous season continued on. with the Intercontinental Cup that Aston Villa lose to Peñarol in Japan, but they win the UEFA Super Cup against Barcelona. This European adventure ends in the quarterfinals of the Champions Cup in March 1983 when they lose to a great, superb Juventus side of Michel Platini, Zbigniew Boniek, and many of the Italy 1982 World Cup winners,
Yeah.
Paolo Rossi, among
Six
others.
six of them, I think. I think.
Right, right. Six Italians along with
Six
Platini
Italians
and
alongside Boniek. I mean, what a
Boniek. Yeah.
team! What a team!
So, do you think perhaps this was the extent of this Aston Villa generation's ascent, and this loss was in a way the reference point for the decline?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's impossible not to look at the 82-83 season as a bit of a last hurrah. Now, obviously, that's a little bit in hindsight, obviously, but I think that there was, you're right, there was a bit of an upturn in league form, but Villa were very inconsistent, and I think sixth was obviously fair. It's what they earned, but it wasn't particularly a sign of any great step forward. I think is that they won some good games and they lost a lot of poor games. I mean, I think, there was a real difference with Barton to Saunders. And I think that, although Barton had won the European Cup, there was still this overriding sense that it was Saunders' team. He was kind of carrying on the methods. And I think that what we saw in 82-83 was a little bit more of an undermining of Tony Barton, unfortunately, in the sense of being able to kind of declare his own message. He was under a lot of pressure from Doug Ellis to make some money back. And the players that you referenced, the Ivor Lintons, all part of the Villa family, but ultimately were kind of peripheral bit part players, really. So a lot of those sales were about trying to balance the books, and there's no doubt that Ellis was putting a lot of pressure on that. I think that the distractions, if you like, of the Intercontinental Cup. I think there was a lot of high jinks out in Tokyo around that loss to Penarol, and the players obviously enjoyed these new experiences that they were having. But I think that often left them a bit undercooked then in the league. Saunders wouldn't have stood for it, Barton did, and I think that players perhaps became a little bit comfortable. And we also began to see this idea that maybe Doug Ellis was sort of beginning to dismantle that European Cup winning side. I mean, I would urge some caution in that narrative, if I'm honest. I mean, Kenny Swain left before Doug Ellis came back. Jimmy Rimmer was dropped by Barton, but replaced by Nigel Spink, who was obviously a hero of Rotterdam '82. So I think that's, although one was going, maybe, it was being replaced with another. The Super Cup is a real standout, though, of that season. I think, that's that last high point, really. And beating Barcelona, who were again a tremendous side, although Maradona missed both games because he was ill, but a real kind of different, maybe a different Barcelona side to what we're used to now. It's a very kind of a robust Barcelona side, which Villa had to kind of compete with on a quite a physical level. The game at Villa Park, I think 10 people were booked, 3 people sent off. I always remember a really vicious Peter with elbow on Migueli, the Barcelona centre half, and which went undetected. But that was that high point. I think beating a really important side that we saw then young players coming into that side through that Super Cup game. And Andy Blair was involved, Mark Walters, Paul Birch wasn't, but was around as well. So there was these sort of beginnings of subtle shifts, but overall, that you're right that when we come to that Juventus quarter final, that feels very much like a line in the sand. And it was, despite the fact that Villa were the holders, when you look at, those six Italians from the '82 winning side, Platini, Boniek, this is a different level, really, and I think that maybe there was some realization at the time that maybe this was the high watermark had happened, and actually Villa weren't investing to the point where they could continue to challenge on that level. And of course, it would prove true because Villa wouldn't play in, well, the European Cup until 2024-25 under Unai Emery. So a huge end of that cycle, if you like.
For the 1983-84 season, we have the arrivals of Paul Rideout from Swindon Town, Steve McMahon from Everton. Later in the season, we have Brighton's defender Steve Foster, the man with the headband,
Yeah.
arriving. But there are departures. You have the Welsh duo of Kevin Rogers and Tony Rees joining Birmingham City. Ken McNaught joins West Bromwich Albion. Jimmy Rimmer is offloaded to Swansea City. And later in the season, Tony Morley joins West Bromwich Albion as well. The team regressed and finished 10th and would play for the last time in Europe for a decade in the UEFA Cup, where they'll be eliminated in the second round to the Soviet side, Spartak Moscow. The only somewhat bright spot was the League Cup run, where Aston Villa reached the semifinals, but this was not enough to maintain Barton, and he would leave at the end of a season. He had a short but important spell with the club. Did this set the tone for the years to come?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I feel I always will feel fairly sorry for Tony Barton in the sense that he didn't such an important manager in Villa's history, obviously, in terms of being at the helm for the European Cup, but never really had a chance to shape his own side. You know, Ellis coming back in had added that pressure of balancing the books. You know, there was not. You know, you're right that there were signings, but they were signings that were then balanced by a lot of outgoings and this continued dismantling of the European Cup winning team. And again, I do have some caution with that narrative. You know, I don't think it was a wholesale they all need to go, but I think we do see a lot of those players going. And some of them, McNaught, wonderful player, brilliant servant to Villa. You know, he was, if not, you know, he was coming towards the end of his career. So there are reasons. I think the Morley sale is one of the most phenomenal things that it's almost just beggars belief. You know, in terms of kind of how we would let that a player as important as that go. But so that maybe does feed into the narrative of dismantling that side. But I think Barton had some really poor luck in that season. So I mean, Gordon Cowans broke his leg in pre-season. Now, obviously a hero of '82, he certainly wasn't going anywhere. He would have been the mainstay of that midfield. So he's out. Gary Shaw then has really the knee injury that would end his career in a couple of years' time. So he's missing these incredibly two important players alongside the fact that others are going and those coming in are in some ways not awfully inspiring. You know, although would obviously go on to have really good careers elsewhere, people like McMahon and Paul Rideout. But yeah, I think it was a really disappointing season and the players were very distraught when Barton was sacked. You know, he was a very popular man, very nice man, and a really sad end to then Barton's life. I mean, he ended up at Northampton, managing Northampton, who at the time were in the fourth division. A lot of heart problems and passed away at just 56 in 1993. So yeah, real somber kind of end for Barton, you know, at Villa, given, you know, that he'd been on that pitch at Decoit hoisting the European Cup above his head.
The 1984-85 season was much of the same as the side finished 10th, as new manager Graham Turner was unable to make headway, as already the Thailand the Euro adventure seemed a distant memory at this point. You have the arrival of French striker Didier Six, and you have the departures of Andy Blair, who joined Sheffield Wednesday, Des Bremner, who joined Birmingham City, Steve Foster would leave and join Luton Town. And in the new year, you have Dennis Mortimer joining Sheffield United, Alan Kirbishley also leaving and joining Charlton, where he would become a managerial legend. Was there a realization that at this point the glory era was over and Aston Villa is more or less has become an average side?
Well, yeah, I mean, and the appointment of Turner was unfortunately, and this is not meant to be disrespectful to Graham Turner particularly, but was very much emblematic of that in the sense that, this is a team that in 1981 had won the league, 1982 had won the European Cup, and now we're appointing the manager of second division Shrewsbury Town, who Turner had done a great job with, but there was this a snobbishness, I guess, or a hierarchical sense of, well, surely this isn't the answer. Again, perhaps in both Turner and Doug Ellis's defence, he wasn't first choice. I mean, my understanding is that Ellis had offered that job to quite a lot of other people before settling on Graham Turner. So Ron Atkinson, who obviously would end up managing Villa in the 90s, Keith Birkinshaw, David Pleat, he wanted some experience, which is ironic that then he turned to Turner, who did not have that. And I think that Turner was set up for a bit of the perfect storm of difficulty, really. You had all this dismantling of the 82 side. You had the end of that Saunders Barton kind of axis and legacy. There's no money, and Doug Ellis benefits essentially from that inexperience by being able to control Turner a little bit. Now, in the years after, Turner would largely deny that Ellis was interfering and so on, possibly out of some respect. But there is no doubt that a manager like Graham Turner offered less resistance to someone as forthright as Doug Ellis as Ron Atkinson would in the future, or David Pleat would have done in this situation. So I think that what we saw was, you're right, a real sort of unraveling. And I don't necessarily blame Turner for that. As I say, he was in this perfect storm, really, where everything was stacked against him. And he made some interesting signings, over the not just this season, but as we kind of go into the next. And people like Paul Elliott and Steve Hodge, who were seen as good young players. Villa again were bringing through young players, so Tony DeRigo, Tony Daly. So there's a kind of sense of maybe looking towards the future, but it just felt like a real denouement that season. And I think if I can, one moment that stands out to me is Villa Reserves actually won the Birmingham Senior Cup that year, which is a competition. Well, each FA in England has a Senior Cup competition where all their members play, and generally the bigger teams play their reserve side or now their under 21 side, and Villa won it that year. And Dennis Mortimer was playing and lifted the Birmingham Senior Cup. And if you think that that's happening 3 years after he's lifted the European Cup in Decoit, I think that sums it up for me.
And was the departure of Peter Witt at the end of that season another reference point of sorts of the team's decline, not to mention those of Cowens and Rideout to the Italian Serie A?
Well, yeah, I mean the dismantling of the 82 team is virtually complete now at this point. It's just really Alan Evans and Gary Shaw who obviously is injured kind of remain. I think Wid's departure was perhaps inevitable. I think what was more surprising rather that Rideout went as well as part of the Cowens deal to Bari in Italy, because Rideout had a very good season. He scored 15 goals in 1984, 1985, and it was only recently that Ollie Watkins actually broke his consecutive game goal scoring record. He held it for a long time for Villa. So I think there was some surprise around that. But again, Steve Stride, who was Villa secretary over this period and into the 90s, often said about Doug Ellis, he couldn't resist a deal. So if someone made an offer for a player, no matter whether that was Tony Morley or Paul Rideout or Brendan Ormsby or Dean Glover, it didn't matter who they were, he would generally accept it because he just couldn't resist. And I think that there's an element with some of these sales at this time. But yeah, it was just all a bit muddled. He didn't quite know what was going on. Like, are we sticking with you? So we're buying Steve McMahon to play with Steve Hodge, but then we're going to sell Steve Hodge because we need to make some money. So they're not playing together. None of it made sense basically. So yeah, another real poor season as financial imperative outweighs anything else, it would seem.
Even though the side had not qualified to Europe and were no longer in a position perhaps to do so, did the Heysel ban, which took effect in summer of 1985, Did it affect the club in any way as it did to English football as a whole, or was the trajectory set at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that the trajectory was set. I mean, I think Villa were so far off the pace by this point of any involvement in Europe. I think they were, in a sense, fortunate they didn't suffer like clubs like Everton did, who were being incredibly successful, but not able to compete in Europe. So yeah, if I'm honest, I mean it's kind of a brief response really, but I just don't. I think Villa was so far removed from that idea of European football. I think they probably suffered as any English club did in terms of perception, and I think that perception would last when they did return into European club competitions, in the sense of some of that suspicion towards English clubs. But I think at the time, in around 85 and high school, is that it was just far from Villa's radar, which again underlines the point of that huge decline, doesn't it?
And things would get worse during the 1985-86 season as the team finished 16th, just above relegation zone. Despite the return of former hero Andy Gray, who had just won the league title with Everton. But you have the departures of Peter Witt to Sheffield United. Of course, the French striker Didier Six goes back to France. We mentioned Cowans and Rideout, and Steve McMahon joins Liverpool and would win the league title. Later, Colin Gibson would join Manchester United. And as far as the arrivals, apart from Andy Gray, you have Steve Hodge from Nottingham Forest, Simon Steinrod from Sheffield Wednesday. Later in the season, you have Paul Elliott coming from Luton, Steve Hunt coming from West Bromwich Albion, and Andy Blair returning to the club from Sheffield Wednesday. But it's a turbulent season, though the team did reach the semifinals of the League Cup. But was it clear that they were in dire straits at this point?
But yeah, I mean this was this was a terrible season. I mean the return of Andy Gray in my mind was entirely a Doug Ellis driven decision. I think it was again a bit of that muddled approach of he felt he needed some experience, so brought him back. He really flattered to deceive in that second spell, but he did offer some experience. I mean, you mentioned the League Cup semi final as a high point, but I mean, I suppose getting to the semi-final was, but then well, we lost to Oxford, who I mean, phenomenal story Oxford that season and Ray Houghton, etc., etc. All really like a great story Oxford. So not wanting to undermine them, but yeah, Villa should have beaten them in that semi-final, and it was ironic because I think the other semi-final was Liverpool QPR and QPR beat Liverpool. So no one would have thought it was going to be an Oxford QPR final. But again, these things just kept happening. These kind of really poor examples. And you mentioned Andy Blair coming back and Steve Hunt. I think that they're probably the two signings that made a real difference. And possibly I'd go as far as to say that they saved Villa from being relegated because the midfield had been a problematic. Hodge had gone again, McMahon had got, all these, nothing had seemed to work. So these two came back and actually, they were fairly kind of industrious players, not doing anything too flash. They just kept it very simple in the middle of that part. They're Turner's assistant manager, Ron Wiley, had worked with them both at Coventry, and I think that little axis just really gave Villa a bit of a platform on which to survive. But that survival was celebrated because survival is celebrated, but I think there was a strong awareness amongst Villa fans that we were circling the plug hole, so to speak, that escape this season did not necessarily mean a better uptake.
Finally, the inevitable happened, and Aston Villa would be relegated in the 1986-87, finishing dead last. You have the arrival of Gary Thompson from Sheffield Wednesday and Martin Keown from Arsenal, as well as Scottish defender Neil Cooper from Aberdeen. But that was not enough, and later in the season, Steve Hodge would join Tottenham. Graham Taylor himself would be sacked as early as September 14th and would be replaced by former Celtic hero Billy McNeill. And he was unable to stop the slide and would last only until the end of the season. Was it seen as inevitable and perhaps a feeling that they might bounce back stronger, or was there doom and gloom and fear for the future?
Yeah, I mean, over the season, I mean, I think, Turner going was inevitable. And I think perhaps should have gone at the tail end of the previous season rather than start. And there was a certain anticipation about Billy McNeill. I mean, he was obviously a hero at Celtic, winning that 67 European Cup. So there was a sense of kind of gravitas around McNeill. That didn't last long. I mean, he actually started okay, to be fair to him. He won, I think he inherited a team that had lost five out of their first six games, so he was on to a loser pretty much straight away. But he did actually kind of sort of turn it around a little bit. Drew 3-3 with Liverpool, which was a great result at the time, and beat some of the teams around them like Coventry and Southampton. I mean, the most damning statistic is that Villa won just two of their last 21 games. I mean, if we talk about relegation form, that is absolutely it. So it's no wonder that Villa finished rock bottom. The players used to call him Billy McBingo because he used the word bingo a lot. So he'd say, "Like, we'll get it in the box and we'll score bingo." And I think there was this kind of sense that he didn't really have a plan, which was absolutely borne out on the pitch. I mean, you mentioned Gary Thompson, which I think was an interesting signing and would be an important one in terms of the following season. He tells a story of arriving at the club, and he was a Villa fan. He grew up supporting Villa. Always wanted to play for Villa. And Gary Shaw said to him, "You're a few years too late, big man," which sums it up, doesn't it? Is that around the club, that realization that really that glory period was well and truly over, and the fact that relegation happened was that kind of final nail in the coffin, unfortunately.
For the 1987-88 season, the former Watford and future England manager Graham Taylor was tasked with the rebuilding and promoting the side from the then second division. And you have a major team overhaul. You have the likes of Paul Elliott, Tony Dorigo, Andy Gray, Simon Steinrod, later Mark Walters, who joined Rangers Glasgow, all leaving the club. You have the arrivals of a Scottish striker, Alan McInally from Celtic, later Kevin Gage from Wimbledon, also Stuart Gray from Barnsley, and a certain David Platt from Crew Alexandra. Was Taylor, was he perhaps the right manager at the right time to get the club back to its former self?
Yeah, I mean, he was a breath of fresh air, an exceptional manager who'd had exceptional relative success with Watford in terms of their promotions and consolidating themselves, an FA Cup final appearance. He came into Villa and it was clear that he was going to be in charge. And it's an overused term, unfortunately, but it was wholesale change. Like everything changed with Taylor. Now, and we've got to remember this is the context. Like, who would have wanted that job? Villa have had this steep decline. Billy McNeill's left them in disarray, not only from relegation, but the playing staff. We've got players like Warren Aspinall on the books who we're not really sure why has McNeill brought him in? What's the plan? You've got players that, like you say, are kind of leaving because of the relegation. Others appear to be staying, but it's a car crash. So the fact that Taylor wanted to do it, I think, is amazing. And he just had such strong conviction in his ideas that had borne fruit at Watford. He had a way of playing, and it was sometimes a bit criticised. The idea of wingers, big target men, that had worked really well at Watford. But he knew what he wanted to do, and actually, after two managers in Graham Turner and Billy McNeill, who to all other views didn't have a plan, what was important that Taylor came in with that plan. What was also important was that he seemed to very quickly understand the relationship that he needed to have with Doug Ellis. there's no doubt he stood up to Ellis and pushed for things he wanted, but in perhaps a more diplomatic way than some of his predecessors. And I think he was very good at managing Ellis in a sense and kind of building his ego a little bit, but actually in a way that would get Taylor what he wanted. And I think we did see player wages actually increased in the season in the second division. I think that says a lot of what Taylor was able to kind of persuade Ellis into, really. So they actually had a good relationship. Obviously, the fact that Ellis would reappoint him in the 2000s, kind of bears that out. And what he brought to Villa was organisation, professionalism. He got the team training at Villa Park. He felt that the team had fallen out of love with the ground a little bit, training at the ground to kind of build that confidence again, that professionalism. If players turned up in things that weren't deemed the official dress code, they were sent home to get changed. Little things like that, I think, just began to change the culture of the club again, which probably had been on the wane since Saunders left. And often football players need this, don't they? They need that kind of channeling and they've got plenty of other things to do. So that structure around them is so important. And that's what he brought to the table. And I think some of his signings that season were exceptional. Alan McInally, for example, bringing in likes of Kevin Gage, Andy Gray, the other Andy Gray, the midfielder, Stuart Gray, Steve Sims, the real kind of players that were kind of built for a promotion push. I think it wasn't plain sailing that season. I think to be fair, it was a bit of a battle, and again, it was a very much a Taylor way of playing in a sense. So with wingers, so Tony Daly but then equally those sort of target men up front, so Alan McInally and Gary Thompson, who actually had a great partnership. But yeah, I think probably the misnomer in all of that is David Platt's influence as well, who was brought in midway. But yeah, there was a real sense of with Villa in that season of a kind of like a band of brothers type vibe. They were going to battle, they were going to hold on in games, and actually, they did just about finishing second, a draw at Swindon on the final day, and Villa were back in the first division.
And David Platt would be the symbol of this end of the decade revival for Villa. We come to the 1988-89 season and a return to the first division, then first division. So you have the departure of Gary Shaw, who joined the Danish league, KB Copenhagen. Others like Warren Aspinall, Neil Cooper also leave the club, as does Gary Thompson and the other Andy Gray, who joins Queen's Park Rangers. The arrivals include Gordon Cowans returning from Italy, from Bari. You have Chris Price coming from Blackburn Rovers. Derek Mountfield arrived from Everton. And later in the season, Nigel Callahan comes from Derby, and Ian Ormondroyd comes from Bradford City. Aston Villa, in their return, just narrowly escaped relegation, but I imagine it was seen as a season of consolidation back in the top division at this point.
Yeah, and I think Taylor was given some grace in essence, in the sense that, because he'd had such a successful season in the second tier in terms of getting promotion, it felt like Villa had a bit more about them again, and there was a bit of that sort of change of culture, and kind of fans felt that. And there was the nucleus of a great team. Mountfield, Platt. I mean, David Platt was. I mean, no one knew who he was. Let's be clear about that. When he'd come in the previous season, from Crewe Alexandra, he scored in his first three Villa games in the second tier. So, Villa fans were incredibly excited to have him in that side that would be back in the first division. As I say, Mountfield. You mentioned Ian Ormondroyd, lovingly called Sticks by the Villa fans. They had a lot in the bank, if you like, and I think, there was a lot of talk of it was transition. The important thing was survival, but it still remained disappointing. And again, I mean, it wasn't quite on McNeil levels, but in that first season back in the first division, Villa only won 2 of their last 15 games. I mean, that is dire, really. And that's despite really strong contributions over the season from Alan McInally again. I think he scored 22 goals. Platt scored 15. So this isn't a bad team, but something wasn't or didn't appear to be quite right. I think maybe particularly defensively, which was sort of somewhat ironic for Graham Taylor. There was enough in the bank that we could think, right, well, we'll move on again. We're back where we wanted to be. We've survived. Let's move on.
The renaissance of the side would occur in the following season, 1989-90 season, at the end of the decade and the beginning of the new one, as Taylor's side unexpectedly finished as runner-ups. You have the departures of Alan McInally to Bayern Munich and Martin Keown to Everton, as well as Alan Evans to Leicester City. But you have the arrivals of a certain unknown young Trinidad striker, Dwight York. Adrian Heath joins from a Spanish league from Espanyol, but he would later leave in the season to join Manchester City. You also have Danish defender Kent Nielsen arriving, and also Irish defender Paul McGrath, who would be an efficient signing for the club, who left Manchester United after his relationship with Sir Alex had deteriorated, Sir Alex Ferguson. And later in the season, as a last ditch effort, I think it was like a transfer deadline day signing, Tony Cascarino arrived from Millwall for a final title push, but in the end, Liverpool predictably won the league title and Aston Villa finished second, which was a major achievement. So not only the side were back in Europe as the Heysel ban was lifted at the end of that year, but David Platt also made the 1990 World Cup squad and would become one of its heroes after he was unexpectedly pushed into a starter position after the injury of Brian Robson. So was this progress beyond anyone's expectations?
Well, without a doubt, and I think as we talked about, that the previous season had ended on that terrible run of only 2 wins out of 15. I think the first problem was the outgoings, and Alan McInally was and remains to this day a huge cult hero at Villa Park. So his departure was seen as a huge blow because we didn't really have another player like him on the books in terms of the physicality, but add with the goals. So Gary Thompson had gone, but then players like Warren Aspinall, did contribute, but ultimately were not Alan McInally. And weirdly, given that he's much maligned by Villa fans in the current day, people were very disappointed to see Martin Keown go because for all his current nuances, he was a good defender and he was on the verge of an England breakthrough. And so I think those two departures were seen as problematic. What we couldn't have bargained for, and you described it in a very understated way, but obviously the arrival of Paul McGrath would prove to be an absolutely wonderful addition and is probably now the club's most legendary player. So I think that was important. But it was important because, as I alluded to in our conversation about the previous season, defensively, Villa needed something more solid. So actually, Taylor went to play three at the back. So that was Derek Mountfield, Paul McGrath, and Kent Nielsen. So McGrath and Nielsen were new additions to play alongside Mountfield. And that, I think, would prove to be a bit of a masterstroke and actually would build the basis that Villa would allow players ahead of them to flourish. I say that it would work because it didn't at first. Again, Villa's run of form from the previous season really continued, and it was a really, really poor start. And there was a lot of talk around the time Villa played Derby at home in what would have been 1989, was that actually Taylor was on the verge of being sacked. And David Platt scored a fairly scrappy goal in that game, and that really proved to be a little bit of a turning point for the side. So actually going from that kind of really poor start to by February, Villa are top of the league with 7 consecutive victories, ending in a great result versus Spurs. One of the games I seem to always remember Everton games, but we beat Everton 6-2 amid that 7 game run, which kind of catapulted us up the league. And I think that's probably the game that really stands out because as much as that defensive solidity was important with that back three and McGrath's influence, obviously Gordon Cowans was back at this point as well. And his combination with David Platt, I think, was what really drove Villa forward that season. And arguably Platt does get the plaudits, and he would go on to international fame in the summer of 1990, as you've said. But it was for me, it's Cowans that season who is absolutely probing and driving Villa forward, and actually gets the best out of Platt that we'd probably see in a Villa shirt, which is saying something because he'd been exceptional. Unfortunately, I just think Villa just lacked a little bit of experiencing those key moments. And really, I think I still believe that in some ways Villa kind of threw that opportunity to win the title away that season. We lost 3-0 at home to Wimbledon and then lost to Coventry away 2-0, I think. Those two results were probably the difference in the end. Liverpool won on both those game weeks, and then suddenly you're behind. And as a lot of teams found out in that era, once you did get behind Liverpool, it was pretty hard to reel them in. Villa again, there's always these things in Villa history of Oldham knocked them out of the FA Cup, and there was just felt like there was this lack of real experience at those big moments, which ended up with us finishing 9 points behind Liverpool, which again in February, March, people would have been quite surprised at that gap. Equally, I think it's testament to Villa's season that we finished 7 points above Spurs in third, so there's a gap there as well. And I think that shows that things largely were a success and an unprecedented one. Last comment though, Tony Cascarino, the first player Villa had ever spent £1 million on. That one didn't work, unfortunately. I mean, he went on to play some great football in France and so on, but for some reason that really didn't work. And actually probably was the start of a period of time going into the 90s and bits of in my book around Villa really struggling to identify a striker to score regular goals. There were always players to chip in, but they didn't replace McAnally. That Cascarino was his replacement ultimately. That didn't work, and I think they did struggle then for a few years after that to consolidate that goal scoring position.
And this success came at a price as Graham Taylor would be prized away to manage the England national team. And this, in a way, may have stopped the side's progress into the next decade. But looking back to beginning of the decade, do you think in retrospect the 1981-82 successes were one-offs and end of a cycle given the trajectory afterwards? And why do you think the club didn't build up on it? Is there a feeling that perhaps a dynasty could have been built with Saunders remaining? And of course, what's Doug Ellis's role in this decline and then brief revival?
What a decade, and God, huge highs, huge lows. It's interesting, just briefly, that you mentioned kind of, Taylor's departure at the end of the decade. So just to briefly touch on that, I think that, that was a huge blow, and I think that with Taylor at the end of the decade, we had what we thought we had with Saunders at the start of someone just inhabiting every element of the club, absolutely owning every single decision, controlling things, a way of playing, a side he built, all those sorts of things. So I think his departure was huge. I also dislike Italian 90 because it made David Platt a world superstar as well. Although he did play in the first decade of the 90s for Villa, it wouldn't be long before he'd go. But going back to the point of the main question, it was very much this cycle of boom and bust, wasn't it? And actually, the club that Saunders had built, in essence, alongside the various board changes, those two League Cups in the 70s, building that side, slowly building what it was to be the league, the league side, those famous 14 players, those same players to then win the European Cup. And although, Saunders obviously deserves huge credit for that European Cup, even though he wasn't around. So I think that there is absolutely a sense for me that if Saunders had stayed, then he would have rebuilt again, and we would have perhaps had a sustained period of success. So I think his departure is that pivoting moment for Aston Villa Football Club. And although they were able to sort of mask that a little bit with Tony Barton stepping in and essentially continuing the journey for a little bit, I think that once that period was over, and we talked about the Super Cup and then losing to Juventus in that 83 quarterfinal. I think that felt the end of the Saunders legacy a little bit, and I think that's the point where really things began to fall apart. And I think that we shouldn't underestimate the financial impact, and the fact that various people at Aston Villa were under police investigation around building and financial irregulation. So, there's a lot of context, outside of the club that is contributing to that. I was relatively dismissive of Heysel per se in its kind of influence on Aston Villa, which I kind of stand by from a playing side. But again, culturally, football is struggling in this period. Gates are down. There's not a lot of money coming in. So there are things feeding into this, but it was always going to be incredibly hard for a club like Aston Villa. People might listen to this and think, well, I thought he was a Villa fan, but we are a historically huge club, but we haven't, over the second half of the 20th century, early 21st century, had that consistent success. This period of winning the league and European Cup, ultimately remains an anomaly. So it was always going to be very hard, but with all those other factors thrown in, it just was going to really struggle. What I would say is that we do then we won't, maybe the 90s will be for another day, but we do see an upturn again, and I think that for a club like Aston Villa, there is always going to be periods of relative success, but to live up to that period between 80 and 82 where we win the league and European Cup is going to be difficult for probably generations of future Aston Villa managers and players.
Yeah, and to think the team went from 5 years from a European Cup to relegation. That in itself is a story that is hard to explain. But you
Well,
did
yeah, I mean,
mention
it's
all the
like,
confluence of events, but still, yeah.
yeah, but I mean, if you think, I mean, what English side last won the European Cup? Manchester City, I guess. I mean, if you think that, if you imagine that they've won the European Cup or the Champions League now, and then 5 years later are relegated. I mean, that would be huge, wouldn't it? Or Chelsea. I mean, Chelsea beat Bayern Munich, didn't they, when they won theirs? And if they were to be relegated 5 years, so it is phenomenal. I mean, I think we both know that football is a different world now. In a sense, it probably wouldn't happen, or it wouldn't be allowed to happen, maybe. And I think that sort of financial imperative that shouldn't be underestimated at that point. There probably was a lot of fans like, well, why aren't we, we've just won the European Cup. Why aren't we buying better players, or after the league, why are we only buying Andy Blair? But if there's not money, there's not money. And particularly, as I say, given that some of it was being squirreled away in places it shouldn't be.
Well, let's talk about kits in this decade. I am somewhat partial for the 1983 to the 1985, the Le Coq Sportif with Maita.
Oh,
Uh,
nice. Yeah.
what can you say about the evolution of kits in this decade?
Well, of course, it's the first decade that Villa have a sponsor. I mean, as indeed for most clubs, obviously. But yeah, so Davenports were Villa's first sponsor in 82, 83. So post the European Cup. I mean, the Le Coq Sportif kits are fantastic and iconic. And I think that the Mitre sponsor that would last for Villa into the 90s, with the addition of copiers. But yeah, you can see that kind of, it's that those very 80s kits without a collar, that kind of shiny material. The Le Coq Sportif ones are iconic. I inherently disliked the Henson kits that Villa wore between 85 and 87. They didn't even have the club badge on it, just said AVFC. Around Villa Park now, you do see some kind of remakes of them, but to me, they just weren't a Villa kit, and I think it's probably not a great surprise, not a great surprise that we wore them when we got relegated. But then the 87, 88 kit, I mean, if we think about away kits, the kit that Villa wore when we got promoted from the second division, so under Taylor, again is a fantastic Hummel kit, like white and blue stripes, which is a really beautiful kit. I've got a version of that in my wardrobe. And again, if you like the home Le Coq Sportif kits, the away ones with, again, quite a different Villa design with like a yellow and claret stripe across with the Mitre sponsor, was superb. But again, I think we can probably gloss over the Henson kits. I just think any kit that doesn't have your badge on, bit odd to me. But yeah, some real iconic ones in there. then. And lovely the fact that Mitre would last into the 90s. They sponsored Villa for a really long time.
There were many emblematic players of this era: Peter Witt, Morley, Shaw, Platt. Is someone like Gordon Cowans also one, as he played in three different spells under three different managers and was present at the revival?
Yeah, we've name dropped Gordon Cowans a number of times over the past hour and 45 minutes. I think that shows that the fact that he played in the 1977 League Cup final replays right through to, as you say, beyond the end of this decade and under Ron Atkinson into the 90s. And he was just an exceptional player. I meet so many Villa fans who they talk about Sid, as he's known, as the greatest player they've ever seen, and in a Villa shirt. And I think that if you talk to other players as well, they all are just in awe of that. And across those generations, even players that came to the club, when he was really at the end of his career, in the 90s, would couldn't believe the things that he did in training. And I do think, if he hadn't have, he had a really bad leg break, and I think that did hinder his progress probably at a time that he could have maybe gone on to even greater things. But to be part of so much of that success, and as you say, also the revival and into that period in the early 90s, just shows his adaptability and longevity. And as I alluded to with David Platt in particular, but with lots of other players, he's a very unassuming man, and he was always quite happy for others to take the limelight, but his play often pushed those players to the forefront. And David Platt would not have been the success he was at Aston Villa without Gordon Cowans. I have no doubt about that. So yeah, wonderful man, wonderful player.
In closing, for Aston Villa fans and historians, what is the legacy of this decade that started in the greatest fashion and ended in a positive note, but the middle third was disastrous? Do the positives outweigh the negatives?
They have to. They have to. And I mean, there are some low lows in this decade, but there is the highest of highs, and you only have to look at, Villa's current trajectory and, taking us into the present day and actually what is a period of relative success without, I guess, trophies, which is problematic. It's a different conversation. But to be a club that has won the European Cup is incredibly important for Aston Villa's history, its ongoing legacy, and its future. It means a hell of a lot. And going back to the start when I referenced, going away to away grounds and singing Champions of Europe, you'll never sing that. That is that highest point, for any European football club. And for Villa to have achieved that is phenomenal. So, whilst there are lows of the decade and then some gain towards the end again, that's football, isn't it? But you want those real glory moments, and we will always have that. And as a club and individuals, and if I think about my son, he's 14. Obviously, wasn't even an apple in my eye when we won the European Cup, but he can name the lineup. And when he sees Tony Morley at Villa Park, he goes up and asks him for an autograph because he knows the importance. We should never underestimate that. And yes, there are lows, but that is the most glorious of highs, I guess.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the links to your book are on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Ivan, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.